Welcome to the Tax Professionals Podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Have you ever come out of a meeting thinking that it was a complete waste of time? Like it was not necessary for you to be there, that your time could be spent better elsewhere? Most people are not taught how to run effective meetings and end up learning from observing instead. What if the people we observe haven't been taught how to run an effective meeting either? For me, being able to run effective meetings is even more important because of client meetings, but regardless of whether you work for an advisory firm within an in-house tax team or elsewhere, being able to run effective meetings will mean you can benefit more from them. In this episode, I am joined by Loren Lazarony, a business skills trainer with a particular expertise in how to run meetings well, and throughout the episode he provides lots of great, straightforward, practical tips that you can implement to enable you to run more effective meetings. As Loren says, it's not rocket science as long as you know how. Let's get to it and put an end to bad meetings. Hi Loren, thanks for joining me today and welcome to the Tax Professionals Podcast.
Hi Jack, good to be here.
It's good to have you here. Just to give a bit of an introduction to the listeners, when people ask you what do you do, how do you usually respond?
Well, I'm a professional trainer. I work a lot in areas of general business skills and specifically project management. So the last few years, I'm based in Germany, so the last few years I've been traveling around Europe, doing lots of trainings in those areas and meeting people from all different industries, and I learn just about as much as I teach, getting to do that.
Oh, that's great. And one of the things you give training in relation to is how to give effective meetings, isn't it? And you do have a course on Udemy at the moment.
Yes, how to have better meetings.
So that's perfect for this episode because that's exactly what we're going to cover today. To hopefully help the listeners to become more effective at running meetings. Just for a bit of context for you, kind of in the tax profession, the type of meetings we can have internal meetings between colleagues, so within the teams, and for other people who work for the same business. For people who work as an advisor like I do, then we'll have meetings with clients as well. Some people who work for businesses, say like Tesco, and they work within their tax team, they'll have meetings with their internal team and also their advisors like me. And then there's also kind of one-to-one meetings. So that's kind of all the type of meetings that we tend to have. When it does come to meetings, though, I think they've kind of got a bit of a bad reputation with some people. And I reckon quite a lot of people would say that they can be a waste of time or pointless. Why do you think it is that meetings have attracted this bad reputation?
Well, that was my inspiration for doing the course, because almost everyone I know complains about spending time in meetings that they feel like they don't need to be at. So I think the main thing is, especially now in modern times, that everyone is super busy. They have a lot on their plate, a lot of work to do. And so if you're stuck in a meeting and you feel like that most of it doesn't apply to you, you start to resent it. And I think that's where it comes, that everyone has such a full load of work to do that you're just thinking like, okay, how can I get this checked off and move on to the next thing? And then if you have to sit in a meeting for an hour that you're only needed for 5 minutes, it's not a good use of your time. And at least from listening to people, that's the main complaint that I hear, that like, oh, they could have sent me an email on this, or they could have just had me talk about this one thing and then leave. Why do I still need to be here?
Yeah, I think that's probably the consensus across a lot of people. And a lot of meetings tend to go on for quite a long time as well, don't they? But when it comes to meetings, do you ever think there should be kind of a limit on how long a meeting should be?
Well, it's hard to say because there's all sorts of different reasons to have different meetings. So sometimes you're, workshopping, and it's a group of people that can't get together very often, and so you put aside the whole day or a series of days for you to do a series of workshops through something. So it's a case by case situation of what's appropriate. But I think typical meetings, typical office meetings and team meetings and staff meetings, they can usually be fairly short. But I think that the biggest mistake that's often made, and again, I don't even want to call it a mistake because in certain situations it might be okay, but that the meeting organizer wants to accomplish too much in one meeting, and so they invite everybody. They have a big agenda of all this stuff they want to accomplish, and then, as I said, that they talk about one topic and 25% of the people there are engaged in that topic, and then they talk about another topic and there's another 25% that are involved in that topic. So what is what I believe is a better way to do it is to narrow your focus on those types of meetings, on those shorter meetings, and figure out, what is the reason we're having this meeting? Is it to make a decision on something? Is it to solve a problem? And think about the actual outcomes and objectives that you want to achieve, and then work backwards from there and figure out, well, who do I need to invite to do that? And again, if you have 5 different topics you want to cover and you're inviting people that only one topic applies to them, that person's going to be bored and resentful for the rest of the meeting. But if it's the other way around, that 4 of the 5 topics apply to them and they have to sit there for 10 minutes while you discuss something else, that's probably okay.
Yeah, I suppose there's nothing worse than feeling like you're wasting 50 minutes of your time in a meeting that's not really relevant to you. So as long as you're feeling like it's relevant, or most of it's relevant to you, then you're going to, I suppose, be much more engaged and feel like it's a better use of your time. I think you have already touched upon a bit of this, talking about kind of thinking about what the reason for the meeting is and what the outcomes and objectives are. But is there anything else that you should think about before you decide to go ahead with a meeting or before you plan a meeting?
Well, I think most people do think about the reason that they have the meeting, but I wonder if those people think deeply enough about it. I've seen a lot of people that, especially like bosses or upper management. I had one former boss that she would have a weekly staff meeting with everyone in the department, and so we would all cram into her office at her convenience, and we would just go around the room and everyone would give an update of what was going on. That meeting was to serve the boss. It was convenient for her, but it wasn't a good use of everyone else's time. And yeah, I mean, you could make an argument that everyone was kept informed out of what was going on, but that could have been handled another way, a little email update or newsletter or just a quick summary of what's going on at the department and hit the important points. So I see people, especially if they're in a position of authority, do things like that all the time. It's like, oh, I'm really busy, so I just want to call this meeting so everyone can report to me and tell me what's going on. But it doesn't work for all the other people that are at the meeting.
Yeah. And as you say, that what that person's trying to achieve could have been achieved in a completely different way that wasn't wasting everyone else's time. Would you say there's any indicators of when you should use a method other than a meeting, kind of like what you've just talked about there?
The meeting where everyone just reports?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, let's say you're thinking about running a meeting and then, you kind of end up with a situation like what you just described there, where it wasn't really appropriate because in that case, it was basically only for the benefit of the person who was hosting the meeting. Are there any kind of indicators where you think that, oh, if this is going to happen, then maybe it's better to have a phone call or an email instead, for example, or some other form of means?
I think in many cases that would be better. And to tell you the truth, even that meeting could have been run differently, that it was just quick little summaries that, we went around that people actually prepared quick summaries and went around the room much more quickly to keep everyone informed, and it wouldn't have dragged on for so long. But, we actually then got into discussions over, well, what's going on in this one person's program or this other person's area, and everyone else was just sitting there bored because they didn't have anything to do with that. So even that type of meeting could have been managed better. And, there is an argument to be made. Sometimes the reason you're having the meeting is to keep people informed, but you just got to find that balance. There's a lot of judgment calls when you're planning meetings.
There is, absolutely. Before going ahead with a meeting, how necessary do you think it is to pull together an agenda? Because I've seen plenty of people who just kind of run meetings off the cuff. What do you think about agendas?
I'm a big fan of agendas. Basically, I believe the more organized you are about the meeting, the better it's going to run. And in the course on Udemy, I basically use like team meetings and staff meetings as a example. So the type of meetings that you're meeting with the same people multiple times, and you're trying to move something forward. So you're usually trying to make decisions about things, you're trying to solve problems, you're trying to assign responsibilities to different people on the team. And so, those type of meetings could really benefit from a strong agenda. And so, write down your reason, the outcomes that you want to have for the meeting, write down your agenda of what you want to cover in the meeting, and then send that out to your invitees a couple days before so they can prepare. And I would even take it as far as, if it's appropriate, if these people are working for you or something, you can actually check in with them to prep them, make sure they know, how long they're supposed to speak, what information is necessary, what level of detail they should cover if they're like reporting on their areas. So it might be, that you have to work with them. If the people in the meeting are your clients, then I don't know if that's appropriate thing to do, to call them and say, here's what I want you to do at this meeting. But as much advance notice, usually 1 or 2 days is enough. You give them a heads up as to, what to expect in this meeting. And then, in the meeting, you can sort of take charge as a facilitator. It's much easier if you're the boss, because then you there's an expectation that people are going to do what you say. But, you might be meeting with your clients, like what you do in the tax consulting world. In project management, you often end up leading a project where you're managing a team of people that don't report to you. So you're managing a team of your peers. So you don't really have authority over them. You've just, been chosen as the leader for this project. And so, you can't just, tell people what to do and bark out rules all the time and orders all the time. But you can establish some ground rules and say, hey, this is how I, am planning on the meeting to go, that we're going to stick to the time, we're going to do this, and just, set expectations of how it should work. And then, have each person do their part. If different people are presenting, make sure they stay on time. If the conversation starts to get off track, say, that's a really good point, but today we need to decide on this, or we need to talk about this, and keep the conversation on track, and make sure you end on time. And if you're working with these people, regularly, you start to build a reputation of giving a good meeting, of
Yes.
people that dread coming to your meetings because they're like, oh yeah, Jack's really efficient. He starts on time, he ends on time, he keeps things on track. You start to gain some respect from people.
I suppose that will help people to want to prepare for your meetings then as well. So even if you're not the boss, as you say, they'll still respect you and then prepare for it properly, which will just help even more in the future, won't it? You have mentioned a few times there about time. So would you organise a meeting for a set amount of time, and would you allocate time against each item on the agenda, or would that be too rigid an approach?
As I give a disclaimer for everything, that of course there might be situations that a little, more flexibility might be appropriate, but most of the time, respecting that people are super busy, they have a lot of other things to do. It's a big deal that they're taking time out to come to your meeting. So yeah, tell them this is an hour-long meeting, or this is a 2-hour-long meeting, and yeah, write down time estimates for each section and stick to it. Some of the meeting management books, they will recommend assigning a timekeeper during the meeting. So you can lead the meeting and then someone else is keeping track of the time to help you keep track of the time. That's not the way I like to do it. I like to keep track of the time myself. One trick, here's a trainer's trick that you can do, is take off your watch, if you wear a watch, and set it on the table. And so if you need to glance at the time, you can just glance down and see it, and you don't do the rude thing of, while somebody's talking, you lift up your arm and look at your watch where you're sending the signal like, oh, they gotta hurry up. So yeah, just have your watch on the table. You can glance down, and then if you see someone's starting to go a little long, then you can politely say, oh, we're gonna run right into lunch. If we don't hurry up, we gotta move on to the next topic.
That's a good point, actually. I've never really thought of that, because the perception you can give if you look down to your watch is not going to be good for the person speaking, is it? And nowadays, anyway, most people use their phones, which is even worse, isn't it? To just get your phone out while someone else is speaking and click on that. So putting that down to help keep the time is definitely helpful. When it does come to building into time, then into a meeting, should any time be allocated to kind of general chatter and just relationship building? Because that's always a part that tends to form part of meetings. You get to have a little catch up with people, especially when we see clients. It's nice to just get a bit of an update about how their business is doing, etc. So should you build any time in for that?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's totally appropriate, and especially with clients, or with teams, that you might want to do a little informal team building or something. Some of that happens naturally, that it takes a few minutes for everyone to show up and settle down and for the meeting to get started. So it's usually in those few minutes where, some people are there early, then, that's when you can do a little networking and talking and stuff. But yeah, I would just keep it reasonable. One place I worked that we typically had hour-long meetings, that was sort of the standard. And usually the meeting started like officially started 5 after the hour and ended at 5 till the next hour. So it was really a 50-minute meeting, but we gave people a 5-minute buffer to get there. And those first 5 minutes were just a chance to, small talk and chit chat and relationship building with people. And then we tried to end 5 minutes before the hour, because very often they had another meeting to be at the top of the hour.
Mm-hmm. It's nice to have that little buffer each side, isn't it? And then you can allocate those 50 minutes out then, can't you, to the real purpose of the meeting. So talking about time, One of the difficulties I think a lot of people have is kind of keeping a meeting on track. I think it's very easy to get sidetracked by some second discussion, or maybe one person within the meeting's got a lot to say on a particular subject. Is there anything you can do to kind of rein the meeting back in if it's going off track, or is it ever appropriate to take a different direction to what you initially envisaged?
Again, that's a judgment call. I've been in meetings that, we thought a certain topic we were going to need 10 minutes to talk about. And then once we got into it, everyone realized, no, we need, 40 minutes to talk about this. It's a lot more in depth. And I've seen one or two things happen. Either that realization that, oh, this is a little bit deeper than we thought it was going to be. So let's, regroup and schedule another meeting just to talk about this. Or that you make the call in the moment, like, okay, this is really important. We need to decide this now. We might have to push back some of the other agenda items, but, let's go ahead and focus on this. And I've seen it done where the leader makes that decision, the facilitator says, okay, this is what we're going to do. And I've also seen it done where they sort of leave it up for a vote. Like, hey, what do you think? Should we, change our tactic on this meeting and focus on item number 1 here and get that resolved, because that's the most important thing. And we'll come back and revisit these other things at another time.
So I suppose it's just like reprioritizing there and then in the meeting, isn't it? If you need to, really, which is just a general skill anyway, isn't it? That you need as a professional.
But if you promise people it was an hour-long meeting, it's not really fair to all of a sudden make it a 2-hour-long meeting, because you don't know what other obligations those people have that they planned on being at another meeting, or going to their child's football game or something. So you got to let them go, even if you can't get everything done. Yeah.
Fair enough. So you can always reschedule, as you say, then, can't you, to cover those last few points. So I think something that's probably quite important when it comes to meetings is having someone to take notes or minutes of some sort. Do you think this would be a dedicated person to that, or should it be everyone taking their own notes?
I'm a big fan of, if someone is available and someone is willing to do it, asking someone to take the notes, take the meeting minutes. Then you can focus on running the meeting and keeping things on track and on time, and then somebody else can take the minutes of at least the main points. The issues I've seen with that is that if someone's never done that before, it does take a little bit of practice to figure out what's appropriate. And, depending on what you're trying to do, those minutes could be more detailed or less detailed. And in my experience, it's usually meetings where we're trying to make decisions and resolve issues and things like that. So the meeting minutes should cover enough background information that anybody reading it would understand what the situation is, what the decision is that needs to be made. Enough of the debate that shows that there, was some discussion, and that discussion led to this decision, and then what that decision is. And then what is probably even more important is that any responsibilities that people accept, that to write that down, to get the person, to say, are you, when do you think you can have this done, and then write a due date down, and so that the person publicly accepts the responsibility and when they're going to have it done. So then you don't have to chase after them to be like, hey, did you do that thing? Did you do that thing? But now it's on record. And when you have a meeting again, you can refer back to that, like, oh, it says that, you were going to have that report done by today. And that, it puts pressure on the person to actually finish what they said they were going to do, because you've documented it in the meeting minutes. There's usually, if you look at most templates, there's usually a section at the bottom for tasks or action items where you can write those things down of what the responsibility is, what the task is, who's going to do it, and they promised they would have it done.
Yeah, I think the biggest points for me anyway there is getting down the background, because there's been quite a few times where I've been in a meeting and you've got that action to do, but then you've completely forgotten the context and then you can't really do anything with the action at that point. So getting that background is definitely an important one, isn't it?
In project management, the world that I come from, sometimes you're working with people that are only involved with the project on like a 20% basis. So it might be your first priority because you're the project manager, but it's not their first priority. So yes, having the background context. So if you haven't met with them for a month and you're meeting again, that you can quickly come up to speed as to what the context was, and documenting the decision that was made. Because what I've seen happen is that when the decision isn't documented, then you meet with those people again and you're trying to move forward and they're like, oh, but what about this decision? And they don't remember that they committed to that one thing. So
yeah,
it's a really good idea to have that written down. And I want to say one more thing about meeting minutes before I forget. It's a really good practice that at the end of the meeting, if there's time, to have the note taker, read back the summary of the meeting minutes to make sure everyone agrees that's what happened, that it's not just that the note taker interpreted something one way, but that wasn't how everybody else felt about it. And if there's not time at the end of the meeting, what I've done is just take that summary of the meeting minutes and then as quickly after the meeting as possible, send it out to everyone that was at the meeting through an email and say, in a polite way, say you have 24 hours to respond if you don't agree with something here. And then if something was, misinterpreted or somebody felt like, oh, that's not really what I said or what I meant, that can be figured out before those meeting minutes become the official document of the meeting.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Actually, I think I'm definitely gonna steal that little tip. You can definitely make sure that no one's got anything to dispute then about the notes and the actions, doesn't it? By giving them a chance to come back to you. You did kind of touch upon it, because I think you're absolutely right that meetings, taking minutes and notes there's a bit of a skill behind it. So for someone who's, let's say, fresh out of university or something and they've come into a new job, it's probably not a good idea to set them to do the meeting notes. So by the sounds of them, have someone with sufficient experience to make sure that they can capture the relevant points down. Is that more of the way you would tend to go for the minute taker?
Well, I don't know if it's that they have to have a lot of experience, but they at least need to understand, you talked about understanding the context, and they need to know enough to know what's going on. So if they've been with the company for 2 weeks, they might not be able to catch all the nuances and all the references and things like that. So it might be someone that has, been involved with the organization or with that type of work long enough that they can, understand the meaning and the context of what's being discussed. And another skill that can be developed from the note taker, the note taker needs to be a little bit bold sometimes too. That, for example, say there's a agenda item that's being discussed, and we're trying to make a decision on something, and the decision isn't really clear. We sort of talk around it, but we never officially say, okay, so we're going to do this. But then the person leading the meeting, the facilitator, says, okay, we're running short on time. Let's move on to the next thing. The note taker could, if they're working really well with the facilitator, could interrupt and say, oh, but before we move on, did we make a decision? Basically saying, I don't know what to write down, and call everybody on it. Like, are we leaving this open for now that we didn't make a decision? Are we writing down a decision? Because, the note taker, I see them like a reporter. So this is their, things are happening in real time. Something's being discussed. They have that moment to capture it. So if that moment passes, everyone might not be sure what was actually said. So it has to be an assertive person that can speak up and say, wait, hold on a minute, before we move on, I just want to clarify, is this what we're doing? Or, if tasks are being accepted by certain people in the group or being assigned, that again, the note taker might need to speak up and say, oh, okay, so, you're accepting this responsibility, and, what's the due date I should write down? So a good note taker can work well with the meeting facilitator that to sort of, keep people honest and make sure decisions were made and responsibilities were accepted, because they're the person that has to write it down.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point about making sure that the note taker speaks up to make sure they got the right information down. Because I just remember when I first started working in tax, I went to kind of a client meeting with about 10 people, and it was about an investigation going on from the tax authority in the UK, HMRC, and I had no experience, so I had no idea of the context at all, and they were talking about points that were really technical, so that went straight over my head and made it really difficult to take notes. And then on top of that, because I was a junior member of staff in a meeting with lots of senior people and important people at the client, I really didn't want to shout up and, ask any questions to make sure I got the notes down right. So definitely having that person who's authoritative and is willing to speak up, I can see how that would be really, really useful to make sure that the notes are as sufficient and good as possible.
And I tell you, I've learned a lot from, taking trainings myself. I've learned a lot from reading books, but I've probably learned the most from, living it, having experiences, failing, and then pondering, well, what went wrong there? I don't want to do that again. I mean, actually, even this topic of meeting management, I was working at a university in New York City, and I was basically like the second in command of the vice president for one of the departments within the university. I was the budget manager, and so anything to do with budgeting or administration, that was my area. And this vice president got fired, and all of a sudden, everyone, I think I was 3 months at the university, and all of a sudden everyone's looking at me for answers. And so I started calling meetings with all the program managers and program directors to try and, keep everyone together and keep everyone communicating. But, I never led big meetings like that. The only meetings I ever led up to that point was just small team meetings that I could manage a lot more. And yeah, I really failed. Like, those meetings quickly got out of control, that some people rambled on. I had one colleague that would just always show up late and then immediately take over the meeting and just start talking about, their opinions on the politics within the university and everything. And I didn't know how to handle it, but it set me on a journey to, like, okay, there has to be a better way to do this. And and even with everything I know now, there's still situations that will catch you off guard, and you maybe don't handle it as well as you want to. But by having some practical things in place, like, knowing the reason, knowing your objectives, setting those expectations with everyone that you invite, having a agenda that you're keeping people on, it can reduce the risk of something like that happening, of someone just walking in and taking over your meeting.
Yeah, it's kind of exactly what you've said there, really. It's all about giving yourself the best chance for it to go as well as possible, and implementing all these tips we've talked about today would definitely help with that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, still the CEO of the company could just walk in and start taking over your meeting, and maybe there's not a whole lot you can do about it. But in most situations, people are respectful for that you have an agenda and you've made these expectations clear from the beginning of what this meeting is about.
Yeah. So I think we've already touched upon this a little bit already. But is there anything you can do to kind of help and encourage people to become more engaged and more involved in a meeting rather than sitting there and I suppose even a bit disinterested and maybe even bored?
Well, it comes back to the first point that we made, that is the reason they're disengaged because 80% of the meeting doesn't have anything to do with them. Or, I guess I would need to know the reason they're disengaged. Are they just being quiet because they're intimidated?
Yeah, maybe let's go with that scenario then. If it's because they're intimidated or fairly shy and they don't say much anyway, is there anything you can do to kind of help them to speak up more and put their ideas forward?
Again, the facilitator, the person leading the meeting, again, setting the expectations early on. I'm a big fan of those ground rules. And, those ground rules could be, anything from, hey, let's try and stay on time. And when one person speaks, nobody else speaks. You'll all get a chance to talk. But it could also be, I invited you all here because, you're subject matter experts, or, there's areas of expertise that you have. So, that I would like to hear from all of you, or I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you during this meeting. And so, sort of give people a warning that, yeah, there's an expectation that they're going to need to talk. If the agenda might be set up in a way that you're actually going around the room and people know when it's their turn. But, also, if I'm in a meeting and we're talking about the budget and there's a finance person in the meeting, I'm naturally going to turn to that finance person and say, hey, what are your thoughts on this? Mm-hmm. I try and be wary and empathetic of, I try not to put people on the spot. So if I call on someone and they don't have anything to say, I don't just sit there and make it uncomfortable. I then move on to the next person. But, I try and set that expectation early on, and then, I try and actually involve everyone and say, hey, what are your thoughts on this? And so go around the room that way when that's appropriate. I don't know if you or your listeners would remember this, but there was a viral video from a few years ago about a guy at a outdoor concert that was dancing, and he got everyone else at the concert to start dancing. And Derek Sivers did a TED Talk about him. He used him as an example of how to start a movement. That his main idea was that, you lead by example, and then the first people to join you engage with them, and you send the signal out to everyone else that it's safe. And I thought this applies to, training like what I do. This applies to meeting management, that if I am leading a meeting that I want people to participate, then I have to, set some ground rules that it's, okay to participate, that participation is expected, and that, no one's going to make fun of you, and there's not going to be, that, let's keep our criticism at a minimum or non-existent. And then those first people that actually participate, that you truly engage with them. And just, it seems so basic, but even things like, hey, that's a really great thought, or, just a nice little thing like that sends out a signal to those shy people, like, okay, maybe it is okay for me to raise my hand or speak up. So that is important as well.
It's this is a I suppose completely irrelevant, but I think it's a good point, because if you show that that's kind of a useful thing for people to do in meetings, then they will follow. But it just reminds me a bit of training a dog. When the dog does something good, give it a treat. That's kind of the analogy that comes back to me a bit. But
no, I have children. I have a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old, and doing business skills training and project management training, in different countries and different places. I've just noticed that many of the, business skills, techniques and tactics about, how to talk to people and how to show people that you are interested in them and value what they have to say, it works with a 5-year-old. Like whenever I start to learn some new skill, I always test it out on my 5-year-old first. And I think just as human beings, we want to be listened to. We want there to be some value in what we have to say. And I, like when my children get frustrated, it's when they feel like we're not listening to them, and rightly so. And I think that is true in a work situation too, that if someone speaks up and they're immediately shot down, they're going to be embarrassed in front of their colleagues. But if someone speaks up and they're engaged with, then oh, I understand what you're saying. And I'm not even saying you have to agree with the person. Maybe you're in a negotiation and you don't agree with them, but your first job is to listen to them and show that you understand what they're saying.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we could have a completely different episode in relation to just listening to people, because I think that's something that maybe quite a few people out there don't do well enough. It's definitely another skill to have. So we have touched upon one thing you can do after a meeting to kind of get more benefit from it in the situation where you haven't been able to confirm the meeting notes and actions during the meeting. But is there anything else that you can do after a meeting to make sure that you get the optimum benefit out of the meeting?
If you've done a good job in the meeting minutes of the list of tasks or action items or responsibilities that people accepted, follow up on that. And if it's one of those meetings that is really a series of meetings, like team meetings that you meet every week or every couple of weeks, or maybe you're working with clients over a period of time, so you have regularly scheduled meetings with them. Once you get started in this series, the next agenda should be much easier because it's going to be based on the previous agenda. So, where did we leave off? Okay, these things were supposed to be done. So, you remind people of those action items, of those responsibilities that they agreed to. At one place I worked, what we used to do is that, we would send out the agenda for the next meeting, 2-3 days ahead of time before the meeting was. And we would copy and paste that list of responsibilities in the body of the email with the person's name and the due date when they said it was going to be done, just again to emphasize their public promise, that transparency of that they promised to do this, just to put a little bit of that peer pressure on them. If they promise to have this done by this meeting, we're giving them a 2-3 day reminder that they should have that done. That always building on the previous meeting. So in project management, obviously that would work very well together. But anytime you're working with a team or people over a period of time where you have a series of meetings, that could work.
Thanks for that one. I think there's some good tips as well. I think probably given the current situation around the world with coronavirus, there's probably a lot more virtual meetings going on at the moment. Do you think there's any difference in approach that people should take when it comes to a virtual meeting as opposed to a face-to-face meeting?
Yeah, people had to become experts on virtual meetings and Zoom overnight. I think the basics are pretty much the same, to have your reason, your outcomes written down, right? Figure out who to invite to reach those objectives, and to have an agenda and stick to the agenda and stick to the time. But yeah, the mechanism is quite a bit different. I think ground rules are even more important here, so you can remind people at the beginning to, mute their microphones or mute their phones or whatever, so you're not being constantly distracted throughout the meeting. The person leading the meeting, I think it's realistic to accept that it's taking a lot of focus, a lot more focus than if you're in a conference room with people, because you're looking at all the participants and who muted their microphone, and you're looking at the agenda and it's this person's time to talk, and then you ask that person a question and you can't hear them because they forgot to unmute their microphone. So you're using a lot more brain power managing a online meeting than you would a face-to-face meeting. So if you have a bunch of back-to-back virtual meetings, over a series of hours, you're going to be pretty tired. So you might want to take that into account and try and space it out and some breaks. I've done some online virtual training, and it's very effective because everyone's very focused on the screen, but it wears you out. So I would be aware of that. But yeah, just make sure people are muted and only the person speaking is unmuted. You might have to direct people more because, if you're in a room and people start speaking all at once, that's confusing enough. But if you're on a conference call or an online meeting and people start speaking all at once, you don't know what's going on because you don't even know who's speaking. So you might have to say, oh, hey, hold on, everyone. You can't speak at once. Let's hear from Frank, and then Sally, then Jack, and then Joe. And you sort of got to take charge a little more and tell people the order in which they're going to speak.
Yeah, and what I have found out as well, actually fairly recently, over Microsoft Teams, the leader can actually just mute people. That could probably come in handy at some point. Those people who are talking over others. But I completely agree. I think focusing on a screen meeting for a long period of time is definitely more wearing on you, isn't it, than sitting in a room with people, and you can't see who's necessarily speaking all the time, can you? As you said. So it's more focus needed, isn't it, really?
Oh yeah, and very often, you don't have the video on because that takes up so much bandwidth. So depending on how many people are in the meeting, you might make a decision not to use the video, and so you can't see people. And okay, are they just sitting there answering emails and half paying attention? Are they really engaged? And so I think more of an effort of trying to be inclusive is necessary. That hey, Joe, we haven't heard from you yet, and things like that to make sure people are still engaged that need to be engaged.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap up our chat, then we've gone through quite a lot of things today that will help people with running more effective meetings. But can you think of the best piece of advice that you've ever been given in relation to being able to run a meeting better? And what was it?
I can't think of actual advice, but I had this experience, and I've talked to many other professionals that had a similar experience, that, this is such a basic thing, but many people don't do it, or many people never learned how to do it. And, I learned how to do it when I got a job at a company in the US that it was a culture and environment that was really big on efficient meetings. And it wasn't like they offered a training in how to do it. It was just, I started going to meetings at this place, and right away I was like, oh, wow, we started on time, we ended on time, we had an agenda, it was on track, that I just saw how efficient it was. And then, after like 2-3 weeks, they started asking me to organize a few meetings. And I learned very quickly that if you weren't good at running meetings, people were very busy and they would stop coming to your meetings. And then you were completely ineffective at your job, and your days would be numbered. So it was a sink or swim situation, but I really just learned this technique by observing and having that experience. And I was talking to some very experienced people, some executives that had told me, like, yeah, I never really knew how to have a good meeting until I worked at this place and they did it this way. So yeah, it's not that hard. I mean, I think that's the thing that makes me crazy about this, is that everything I'm talking about, it's not rocket science. It's all pretty practical organization that I'm talking about. But yet so many people don't do it, or so many people just haven't thought about it, or so many people just thought, oh, this is easy for me to do it this way. So yeah, I don't know if I've been given advice, but the advice I would give to other people is, just take a step back and think about it, and think about what you can do to have better meetings and to truly invite people that are going to be engaged the majority of the time of what you're discussing.
Yeah, and then hopefully all the tips they can take away from this episode as well will turn them into meeting experts.
Or they could take my course. It's only an hour long. You could take it in a lunch break. How to have better meetings on Udemy.
Yeah, and where else can people find out a bit more about you, Loren? Have you got a website?
Yes, Laz International, all one word, .com. So L-A-Z, or you're in UK, so L-A-Z, International.
Yeah, and I'll put links to both your Udemy course and your website into the show notes. I think you mentioned that you might have an offer in relation to the course you've got on Udemy at the moment.
Oh yes, that for your listeners, I will, or I guess you will, post a coupon code. It would only be good for 30 or 31 days, I think, after the release of this podcast, of this interview. But I'll assign a discount code so that people can take, if they're interested in taking the course, they can get a Jack Bonehill discount.
Thanks very much for that, and thanks for joining me today on the podcast. I found it very informative and useful. I hope you've taken away some good tips there that you can have a go at using to improve your meetings. Next time you're about to organise a meeting, why not think whether a meeting is appropriate or whether an email or phone call would do instead. Before the meeting, think about the objectives and pull together an agenda. Make sure good notes are taken, capturing the actions, enough context and background to understand the actions, who is responsible for the actions, and the deadline. You can find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as where to find further information about Loren in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP7. TTPP7 stands for The Tax Professionals Podcast Episode 7. To make sure you're made aware of all future episodes, you can subscribe to the podcast through your podcast app or head over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe for email notifications. That's it for this episode. Until next time.